The sea was silent, until it wasn't. A German U-boat glided through the ink-black depths of the North Atlantic, its steel hull creaking under pressure. Inside, red lamps flickered across sweating faces. Men whispered over dials and charts, listening for the faint hum of propellers far above. For months, they had been hunters. Now, something had changed. Through the hydrophones came a rhythmic pulse, soft, steady, unnatural. It wasn't an engine. It was a ping. Seconds later, explosions rolled through the deep. The sonar man screamed, "Achtung! Depth charges!" The commander ordered evasive maneuvers, but the destroyers above didn't lose them. Every turn, every descent. They followed with surgical precision. When the hull finally cracked and the ocean roared in, the commander's last thought wasn't fear. It was confusion. How could the Americans see them down here, in total darkness? No one aboard that U-boat yet knew that America had weaponized sound itself. In the early years of the Second World War, the Atlantic Ocean became a graveyard. From 1939 to 1942, German U-boats roamed its vastness like wolves, unseen and unstoppable. Britain, an island dependent on the sea for food, fuel, and weapons, was slowly strangled. Entire convoys vanished beneath the waves, leaving oil-slicked debris and frozen bodies adrift in the gray water. The Kriegsmarine called it Der Atlantik-Schlacht, the Battle of the Atlantic. Admiral Karl Dönitz envisioned a wolf pack strategy. Small groups of U-boats coordinated by radio to ambush Allied convoys. It was a war fought without front lines, where every sound, ripple, and echo meant survival or death. In the first half of the war, the Germans held a deadly advantage. Their Type 7 and 9 submarines were masterpieces of engineering. Sleek, silent, and deadly at depths beyond what most destroyers could reach. Allied sonar, still primitive, often failed to distinguish a submarine from a shoal of fish. Radar could not penetrate the ocean. Aircraft, though expanding in range, were blind to the undersea domain. By mid-1942, Britain was desperate. Over 700 ships had been lost that year alone. Winston Churchill later confessed, "The only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." Every merchantman sunk meant fewer supplies, fewer tanks for North Africa, fewer aircraft for Europe. The Atlantic was not merely water. It was the artery that kept the Allies alive. Then, something shifted. Across the ocean, in America, science began to mobilize on a scale history had never seen. Universities, laboratories, and industries were pulled into a single war machine of research. The newly created Office of Scientific Research and Development, OSRD, coordinated breakthroughs from radar to rocketry. But one of its most secret projects dealt not with sight, but with sound. At Harvard and MIT, physicists began working with naval engineers to understand how sound behaved underwater. The ocean, they realized, was not silent. It was alive with echoes, from whales, waves, and distant ships. A chaotic symphony that could either conceal or reveal a submarine. To track a U-boat, one needed to see through sound. This was no simple task. Sound bends as it travels through layers of varying temperature and pressure, refracting like light through glass. What scientists discovered was revolutionary. By understanding these layers, they could predict where sound would travel and where it would vanish. The United States Navy soon founded specialized research centers, the Underwater Sound Laboratory at Harvard, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in Massachusetts, and key acoustic facilities at Bell Labs. Their mission: to transform the ocean from a hiding place into a hunting ground. Early sonar, known as ASDIC, had existed since the First World War. But now, America sought something far beyond simple ping-and-listen systems. They wanted acoustic mapping, to chart the ocean's contours, detect enemy vessels, and understand how sound revealed the unseen. In 1941, before Pearl Harbor, American scientists had already begun experimenting with hydrophones placed at different depths to listen for distant ships. When the U.S. entered the war, that research accelerated with ferocious urgency. They learned to interpret faint echoes that traveled along the deep sound channel, a natural layer of water where sound could travel for hundreds, even thousands of miles with little loss of energy. By late 1942, the Americans had developed sonar sets so advanced that their destroyers could detect a submarine hundreds of meters deeper than before. Combined with improved depth charges, faster calculations, and radar-guided aircraft patrols, the hunter became the hunted. And while the Germans relied on mechanical perfection, steel, fuel, discipline, the Americans embraced physics. But this transformation didn't happen overnight. It was born in dark laboratories filled with chalk dust and humming oscilloscopes. Scientists who had once studied whales and sound waves now plotted the destruction of submarines. The ocean became their battlefield. The war for the Atlantic was no longer just about torpedoes and tonnage. It had become a war of frequencies, reflections, and echoes. And beneath it all, one question lingered. How could sound, invisible and fleeting, be turned into a weapon that could see through the sea itself? The answer to that question began deep within the laboratories of the American East Coast, far from the gunfire and torpedo wakes of the Atlantic. At the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in Massachusetts, oceanographers and physicists collaborated in secrecy under Navy contracts. Their mission: to turn theoretical acoustics into battlefield intelligence. The project was simple in aim, yet monumental in scope. Understand how sound traveled through salt water at different temperatures, depths, and pressures. Every variable mattered. Even a single degree of temperature could bend a sound wave across miles. Layers of warm and cold water acted like mirrors and lenses. The scientists found that in the ocean's middle depths, typically around 1,000 meters, existed a narrow band called the Sonar channel, the sound-fixing and ranging layer. Here, sound could travel vast distances, trapped between layers that refracted it back toward the center. This was nature's hidden telegraph line. If a submarine made noise within that channel, the sound could echo across oceans. To the engineers at Woods Hole and Bell Labs, that meant the sea could be listened to like a planet-sized ear, simultaneously. At Harvard's Underwater Sound Laboratory, scientists worked on perfecting active sonar, emitting sound pulses and measuring their return. They designed devices that could distinguish between the echo of a whale, a rock, or a submarine hull. Each target had its own acoustic fingerprint. The key was precision and interpretation, an art as much as science. One of the young physicists, Maurice Ewing, later known as the father of modern ocean acoustics, pioneered experiments that mapped the ocean floor using reflected sound waves. His wartime studies laid the groundwork for what would later become acoustic oceanography, the ability to chart underwater topography without ever seeing it. By 1943, Ewing and his colleagues were quietly producing the first sound maps of the Atlantic. They could identify submarine routes, thermal layers, and seafloor contours. The Germans, obsessed with metallurgy and propulsion, never imagined that their steel beasts could be betrayed by invisible vibrations. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy began deploying sonar-equipped ships in convoy protection groups. Each destroyer carried a dome-like transducer mounted under its hull, emitting sharp pulses, pings, that pierced the depths. The returning echoes painted a ghostly image of what lay below. The equipment operators learned to interpret the faintest distortions, the subtle change in pitch that meant a U-boat was turning, diving, or even changing speed. Every new convoy became a live experiment, The Navy's tactical school at Key West trained hundreds of sonar operators, emphasizing interpretation and instinct. They were the new generation of acoustic warriors, men who fought through headphones, not periscopes, and while the Germans refined their U-boats, installing quieter motors and improved batteries, they were unknowingly fighting an enemy that had already moved to another dimension, the soundscape of the sea. In Berlin, reports of sudden Allied efficiency puzzled the Naval High Command. U-boats were being destroyed with uncanny precision. Convoy attacks that once ended in Allied losses now ended in German annihilation. Dönitz suspected radar improvements or secret aircraft patrols. He had no idea that the Americans had begun hearing the ocean itself, but the innovation didn't stop there. As scientists learned to read underwater acoustics, they began developing long-range hydrophone networks, the earliest prototypes of what would one day become the SOSUS system, Sound Surveillance System. By anchoring hydrophones along the continental shelf and deep-sea ridges, the U.S. Navy could listen across entire ocean basins. This idea was born in 1944, but its roots lay in these frantic wartime experiments. In essence, America had turned the sea, the U-boat's greatest ally, into its own instrument of detection. And for German engineers, who had built their naval supremacy on stealth and silence, this revelation would come as a profound shock after the war. For now, though, in the mid-war years, they only knew one thing. The hunters had become the hunted, and the sound that marked that change, that cold, mechanical ping, would echo through history. By 1943, the Allied navies had begun to realize that sonar could do far more than simply detect a submarine. The emerging technology allowed ships to map the underwater world itself. Using timed echoes, sonar operators could calculate not just distance, but also the shape and texture of the seafloor. When integrated across thousands of data points, these readings formed primitive acoustic maps, the first ever glimpses of the ocean floor on a continental scale. This innovation was staggering in its implications. Until then, the ocean had been humanity's final unknown. Beneath the surface lay a landscape as vast and uncharted as the moon. The Germans had mastered steel and precision optics, but the Americans were mastering perception, turning the invisible into something measurable. Bell Labs, RCA, and Western Electric contributed cutting-edge hydrophone arrays, while MIT developed refined oscillators and amplifiers that could isolate faint echoes buried in noise. Naval destroyers began using echo-sounding runs not just for hunting U-boats, but to chart deep-water corridors, submarine trenches, and continental slopes. The strategic effect was immense. Knowing the contours of the seabed meant knowing where submarines might hide. The Atlantic, once a blind expanse, was now a layered theater of acoustic geography. Hills, valleys, and sound channels. Each feature could either amplify or distort sonar, and American scientists learned to use this to their advantage. The technology was still imperfect, but it represented a paradigm shift. Sound had become both a weapon and a map. While engineers built the devices, it was the operators, often young sailors barely out of high school, who gave sonar its soul. Their world was one of patience, concentration, and fear. For hours they sat in dimly lit sonar rooms, headphones pressed tight, listening to the hum of the ocean. They heard things few humans had ever heard. The distant songs of whales, the rumble of deep-sea currents, the rhythmic tapping of enemy propellers. Every noise had meaning. Every echo might be life or death. These operators developed an almost mystical relationship with sound. They could tell when a submarine turned, when it ascended, when it tried to hide in a thermal layer. One sailor described it as listening to ghosts through water. Behind these men stood an unseen army of scientists and mathematicians. The acousticians, who translated nature's chaos into logic. People like Maurice Ewing, J. Lamar Worzel, and Alan Vine, who later became legends in oceanography. Their work was meticulous, mathematical, and exhausting. They analyzed how the thermocline, the boundary between warm and cold water, bent sound. They built experimental tanks to simulate ocean layers. They recorded echoes bouncing off steel plates to mimic submarine hulls. It was this bridge between science and seafaring that made American sonar unmatched. The collaboration was so effective because it united two worlds that had never before worked together, the academic and the martial. One admiral famously remarked, "For the first time, the Navy and the laboratory share the same battlefield." In practice, the new acoustic tools changed everything about how convoys operated. No longer were destroyers forced to drop depth charges blindly. Now, attacks could be calculated with astonishing precision. A trained sonar operator could estimate not just distance, but direction, even a submarine's speed and course. This precision gave birth to a deadly tactic: the creeping attack. One destroyer would maintain sonar contact, while another silently approached the target at low speed, engines muffled. Once the range was confirmed, the second ship released a perfect pattern of depth charges, often annihilating the U-boat before it could react. The psychological impact on German crews was devastating. Many U-boat captains reported being hunted for hours, sometimes days, with no clear understanding of how the enemy maintained contact so flawlessly. Some thought the Allies had developed magnetic sensors or supernatural detection. In truth, it was science, invisible, relentless, and exact. By mid-1943, the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic began to turn. For every merchant ship sunk, 2 U-boats were now being destroyed. Allied sonar and aircraft coordination made the seas increasingly lethal for the once invincible wolf packs. At the same time, ocean mapping efforts began to uncover something deeper: the vast undersea mountain ranges and trenches that defined the Atlantic floor. Though the war effort kept these discoveries classified, the implications extended far beyond warfare. Every ping, every echo, every measurement added a new pixel to the hidden portrait of Earth's last unexplored frontier. America's effort to destroy U-boats had unintentionally begun the age of acoustic cartography. Sound as a means to understand the planet itself. The Germans would soon discover just how much their adversary had learned, and how far behind they truly were. When the war finally turned against the U-boat arm in 1943, confusion rippled through Germany's naval command. Their submarines, once predators, were now being annihilated with unexplainable precision. Patrols that had hunted safely for years began disappearing without a trace. Crews reported strange phenomena: Allied destroyers that seemed to know their position even in radio silence, even hundreds of feet below. German engineers at Kiel and Lorient worked obsessively to understand what was happening. They improved hull coatings to absorb sound, installed rubber anechoic tiles, and experimented with new sonar countermeasures like the Pillenwerfer, canisters that produced decoy noise bubbles. But none of it truly worked. Allied ships adapted too quickly, adjusting to each innovation as if they anticipated every move. It wasn't until after the war that the full truth emerged. Captured reports and declassified American files revealed the astonishing extent of U.S. research into underwater acoustics. German scientists, trained in precision mechanics and metallurgy, were stunned to discover that the Allies had transformed the ocean into a field of measurement and mathematics. They learned that America had created entire naval listening networks, stretching from the continental shelf to the mid-Atlantic. These weren't simple sonar devices, they were arrays, hundreds of hydrophones connected by cable, capable of triangulating submarine positions based on the timing and direction of sound waves. To the German engineers, it was almost incomprehensible. While they had sought silence through design, their enemy had sought knowledge through nature. The Americans hadn't tried to outbuild them, they had outthought them. One German naval officer later remarked during interrogation, "We built the finest submarines in the world, but you built the ocean around them." That quiet line summed up the shock that rippled through post-war German scientific circles. The technological battleground had shifted from steel to sound, from what could be seen to what could be heard. Out of wartime necessity emerged an entirely new field of science: underwater acoustics. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the scientists who had built tools of war turned them toward discovery. Maurice Ewing, J. Lamar Worzel, and others continued their ocean experiments through what became known as the VIMA expeditions, using surplus Navy sonar equipment to map the Atlantic in unprecedented detail. What began as a weapon to find submarines now revealed the existence of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, a mountain range thousands of miles long, hidden beneath the sea. This discovery would later reshape geology itself, forming the foundation for the theory of plate tectonics. It was ironic. The technology built to win a war had accidentally unlocked one of Earth's greatest secrets. The wartime sound channel experiments evolved into the SOFAR project, allowing long-distance acoustic communication and later global ocean temperature monitoring. Navy data collected to hunt submarines would, decades later, help scientists measure climate change by tracking sound speed variations caused by temperature shifts in the deep ocean. But the immediate, post-war years brought something darker: the transformation of sonar into a weapon of global surveillance. The Cold War pushed America to expand its wartime experiments into the SOSUS network, a vast grid of undersea microphones stretching across the Atlantic and Pacific. Originally designed to detect Soviet submarines, SOSUS was the direct descendant of the acoustic discoveries made during World War II. German scientists, many of whom were recruited under Operation Paperclip, were astonished by the depth of American acoustic infrastructure. They had considered sound merely a tool for navigation and depth measurement. The Americans had turned it into a language, one capable of describing the entire ocean. The broader world wouldn't learn of these technologies for decades. Classified for national security, the details of early ocean mapping remained buried in naval archives. Civilian oceanographers only gained access to parts of the data by the late 1950s. Yet even then, the transformation was clear. Humanity's understanding of the sea had leapt forward by centuries, compressed into just a few frantic years of wartime research. This revolution was more than scientific. It was philosophical. For the first time, humans could perceive the unseen environment that covered most of the planet. The ocean was no longer a void, but a structured, living landscape of sound and motion. Behind the scientific triumph lay a quiet moral paradox. The same techniques that mapped the ocean's hidden world were born from the need to destroy. The same sound waves that revealed beauty were calibrated to kill. To many of the scientists, the realization was sobering. After the war, some refused to continue military contracts, choosing instead to dedicate their research to peaceful oceanography. Yet others, recognizing the geopolitical stakes of the Cold War, remained within classified naval programs. In the end, the ocean itself had become both witness and weapon. Sound, once the language of music and communication, had been transformed into the signature of modern warfare. The ocean, vast and indifferent, echoed both discovery and destruction. And though the war was far from over in 1943, one thing had already become clear. The battle for dominance beneath the waves was no longer fought by machines alone, but by the human mind's ability to understand what lay beyond sight. The next chapter of that struggle would unfold in the Atlantic, where sonar, science, and strategy would converge in a moment that forever changed the fate of the U-boat fleet. The climax of this invisible war arrived in 1943, the year the Atlantic changed sides. For almost 4 years, the U-boats had ruled the ocean with silent terror. But now, the sea itself began to turn against them. American and British destroyers, guided by advanced sonar and radar coordination, started hunting the hunters with mathematical precision. Convoys that once feared the periscope now struck back with calculated vengeance. The critical moment came in the spring of 1943. It was known to history as Black May. In just 1 month, the German U-boat arm suffered catastrophic losses. 41 submarines sunk, hundreds of trained men lost, and the illusion of invincibility shattered forever. Allied escorts, equipped with the latest QGB and QLA sonar sets, could track submarines through thermal layers and maintain contact even during evasive dives. For the first time, sonar wasn't just hearing, it was predicting. Destroyers no longer attacked blindly. When sonar detected a faint echo, operators could analyze the Doppler shift, the change in frequency caused by a moving submarine, and calculate both its direction and velocity. Using that data, attack coordinators plotted intercept patterns with stunning accuracy. The German U-boat crews, accustomed to the chaos of guesswork warfare, suddenly faced an enemy that seemed omniscient. Every maneuver failed. Every trick, from turning into the sonar beam to diving beneath the thermocline, was anticipated. The USS England became a legend that spring. In a single 12-day period in May 1944, using a combination of sonar tracking and Hedgehog forward-firing mortars, she sank 6 Japanese submarines, a record unmatched in naval history. But her method was perfected first in the Atlantic, where destroyers used sonar pings as both weapon and guide. Each echo told them where to strike. Each silence warned when a submarine had slipped deeper into the abyss. To the sailors aboard destroyers like the USS Buckley, Haverfield, or Campbell, the sound room became a kind of nerve center, a place where the ocean's language was translated into death. You'd hear the ping go out, one sonar operator recalled, and if the echo came back faster, you knew you were closing in. You could feel the enemy before you ever saw him. In the darkness of the North Atlantic, the once mighty wolf packs found themselves cornered. U-boat after U-boat was forced to surface, crippled by depth charges and damage. On the surface, spotlights and tracer fire awaited them. Crews leapt into freezing waters as their submarines sank beneath the waves, often still echoing with the pings of the destroyers that had hunted them. The Allied advantage was not merely technological, it was systemic. Sound was now integrated with radar, code-breaking intelligence, and air reconnaissance. British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park decrypted German Enigma signals, giving approximate positions of wolf packs. Sonar then provided exact locations. Science and intelligence had fused. And in that fusion lay the death of the U-boat war. By mid-1943, Admiral Dönitz was forced to withdraw his submarines from the North Atlantic entirely. The hunter fleets were disbanded. Production priorities shifted desperately toward new models like the Type Vuxtifan Electroboot, a revolutionary design intended to operate submerged for longer periods. But it was too late. The Allies had already mastered the ocean's invisible architecture. For every new German design, there existed an American countermeasure based on acoustic insight. The U.S. Navy developed Foxer noisemakers, towed devices that lured German acoustic torpedoes away from their targets. Meanwhile, Allied scientists began experimenting with low-frequency sonar capable of penetrating deeper and detecting submarines at greater ranges. The balance of power had irrevocably changed. What began as a contest of engines and torpedoes had become a duel of mathematics and physics. From the decks of destroyers to the depths of research labs, sound had become the decisive weapon. Not through destruction, but through detection. The Allies no longer sought to overpower the Germans by numbers alone. They sought to understand the sea better than their enemy ever could. Every U-boat sunk after 1943 carried within its demise the echo of that understanding. The moment when sound, once a blind force, became an instrument of strategy. Yet even as the tide turned, something deeper was emerging in secret American facilities. Experiments that reached beyond warfare toward something almost visionary. The ocean was no longer just a battlefield, it was a system, a medium through which knowledge itself could travel. And in the next stage of this transformation, America would learn to map that medium, to trace its depths, its currents, and its hidden mountains using nothing but echoes. As German submarines burned and sank across the Atlantic, another war, one fought in silence, was being won inside secret American laboratories. While sonar operators tracked the U-boats in combat, scientists back home were turning those same technologies into a new kind of intelligence: acoustic mapping. This was more than submarine detection. It was the first attempt in human history to chart the planet's most inaccessible frontier using sound. The foundations were laid in 1943, when Maurice Ewing and his team began systematically firing sound pulses into the Atlantic from research vessels. Using specialized hydrophones, they recorded the echoes that bounced back from the seafloor, transforming milliseconds of sound delay into measurements of depth and contour. The results were astonishing. Beneath what had once been thought of as a flat seabed lay a vast, rugged mountain range, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. In the middle of a world war, while the Allies fought to preserve civilization above the surface, they had simultaneously discovered a new world beneath it. These experiments had direct military value. By mapping the ocean floor, naval planners could identify submarine routes, undersea canyons, and depth zones ideal for concealment or attack. Sound navigation systems, refined during wartime, evolved into the fathometer, a continuous echo-sounding device that painted a rolling acoustic map of the terrain below. The implications extended even further. Scientists realized that sound could be used not only for depth but for distance. By deploying synchronized sound sources and receivers across large areas, they could triangulate the position of an object, even a moving one, anywhere within the grid. This principle would later evolve into long-range submarine tracking networks, but its conceptual birth occurred here, amid the urgency of war. The Navy saw what it meant immediately. If the ocean could be measured, it could be controlled. Throughout late 1944, classified trials began off the U.S. East Coast to test large-scale acoustic detection arrays. Using long cables fitted with hydrophones spaced at intervals, researchers discovered they could hear ship traffic tens of miles away. Variations in sound arrival times between sensors allowed precise location tracking, a revolutionary concept that hinted at the future SOSUS network of the Cold War. But to the men who ran these tests, the discoveries felt almost otherworldly. They were learning to listen to the heartbeat of the planet. At Woods Hole, engineers described the ocean as a living, breathing organism, one that responded to pressure, temperature, and energy with rhythms of its own. When the team realized that low-frequency sounds could travel through the deep SOFAR channel for thousands of miles, they began sending coded test signals from Bermuda to the Bahamas and receiving them clear and undistorted. It was as if the sea had become a vast communication line, a natural wire connecting continents. The military implications were staggering. Messages could be transmitted silently, undetectably, and across immense distances, tracking enemy submarines, guiding friendly fleets, even coordinating across oceans, all suddenly possible through acoustics. By the war's end, the U.S. Navy had not only defeated the U-boats, it had redefined ocean warfare itself. The Germans had built faster submarines, but the Americans had built a smarter ocean. In the final months of 1945, as Germany collapsed and U-boat pens fell silent, captured naval engineers were interrogated by Allied scientists. What they learned shocked them. The Germans had never even theorized the SOFAR channel. They knew nothing of acoustic propagation layers or thermal sound refraction. They had spent their resources perfecting machines, not understanding the medium those machines lived in. This was the fundamental difference between the two sides. Germany pursued dominance through material perfection, America through environmental mastery. When German officers visited Woods Hole and Harvard's laboratories after the war, they were speechless. Banks of oscilloscopes, signal analyzers, and sound tanks filled entire buildings. Every surface hummed with cables and wave generators. What had begun as a military necessity had evolved into a national scientific institution. To the Americans, these rooms represented the future. To the Germans, they represented something humbling. Proof that the war had been lost not merely on the battlefield, but in the mind. One former Kriegsmarine engineer wrote years later, "We designed the perfect vessel for silence, yet it was useless against those who could hear the silence itself." The war's acoustic revolution had reshaped more than tactics. It had redefined humanity's relationship with the sea. For the first time, the ocean was not a void. It was a map, a system, a living domain that could be charted, measured, and understood. And as American scientists continued their work into the post-war years, they began to realize something profound. The same technology that had silenced the U-boats could also illuminate the Earth. The next battle, then, would not be about who could dominate the ocean, but who could comprehend it. When the war ended in 1945, the oceans fell silent again, but for the men who had listened to them, the silence was different now. It was no longer the unknowable abyss that had swallowed ships and men. It was a charted, measured space. America's wartime marriage of science and the sea had permanently altered the relationship between humanity and the ocean. For Germany, the shock of defeat was both military and intellectual. The Kriegsmarine's engineers, once considered the elite of marine design, found themselves confronted with technologies that seemed decades ahead of their own. When Allied forces seized the naval bases at Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and Wilhelmshaven, they found U-boats in dry dock beside captured sonar gear, crude by comparison to American systems. Many of these German devices still relied on passive hydrophones that could only detect propeller noise within a limited range. Meanwhile, Allied sonar could project, interpret, and map, turning every wave of sound into a topographic portrait. Captured German scientists were interrogated at naval intelligence centers in London and Washington. What they learned from their captors stunned them. The United States had, by war's end, effectively built a working prototype of an acoustic surveillance network that could cover entire ocean sectors. In the words of one astonished German officer, it was as if they had fitted the sea with eyes. At the same time, thousands of tons of wartime research data, sonar logs, echo sounder readings, and acoustic transmission studies were declassified and transferred to American universities. The U.S. Navy, rather than dismantling its wartime labs, expanded them. The Harvard Underwater Sound Laboratory merged into the newly formed Navy Electronics Laboratory in San Diego. Woods Hole, once a small research outpost, became one of the world's foremost oceanographic institutions. The scientists who had built tools of detection now turned those same instruments toward understanding. They used sonar to explore the ocean floor, map continental shelves, and locate geological structures unknown to mankind. In 1947, only 2 years after the war, Ewing and Worzel's acoustic surveys uncovered evidence of deep trenches and ridges, proof that the seabed was not static, but dynamic. Those discoveries laid the foundation for plate tectonics, one of the greatest scientific revolutions of the 20th century. And yet, Beneath the optimism of discovery, a new kind of war was taking shape. As the Iron Curtain descended over Europe, the same American acoustic expertise that had destroyed the U-boats was quietly redirected toward the Soviet threat. The logic was simple. If sound could reveal German submarines, it could also reveal Soviet ones. Thus began Project Jezebel, and later the SOSUS system, the Sound Surveillance System, a vast, classified network of hydrophones stretched across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Maintained by the U.S. Navy and built in collaboration with Bell Labs, it could detect the acoustic signatures of submarines thousands of miles away. In the language of secrecy, it was known as listening to the deep. By the early 1950s, what had started as an experiment in wartime detection had evolved into a planetary-scale instrument of observation. American naval engineers now spoke of acoustic geography, the idea that every ocean had its own sonic fingerprint, a pattern of echoes shaped by its currents and geology. To the rest of the world, these achievements remained hidden behind classified doors. To the Germans, rebuilding a shattered nation, the truth was both humbling and inspiring. The very science that had defeated them was now transforming into a global pursuit of knowledge, one where former enemies might one day collaborate. In that irony lay the enduring legacy of America's wartime sound revolution, the transformation of destruction into discovery. And as the world entered the uncertain calm of the Cold War, the sea, once a place of terror, had become the greatest listening post in human history. The end of the Second World War marked not just a shift in global power, but a fundamental redefinition of what it meant to know the planet. Through the technology born of war, America had unlocked the hidden architecture of the Earth itself. The scientists who once hunted submarines now hunted knowledge, and their new quarry was the ocean's secret anatomy. In 1946, former Navy sonar experts joined the first post-war scientific expeditions under Operation Crossroads in the Pacific. Using sonar and acoustic echo sounding, they mapped the seafloor around Bikini Atoll before the atomic bomb tests. For the first time in history, human beings had a detailed view of the ocean's underbelly. What had once been a dark, unknowable expanse became a world of mountains, canyons, and plains, as real as any landscape on land. The transformation was philosophical as much as technical. The war had begun with nations fighting to control the sea. It ended with humanity learning to understand it. Germany, for all its industrial genius, had underestimated the power of scientific abstraction, the ability to think in invisible patterns rather than visible machines. Their submarines had been marvels of engineering, but they had no counterpart to the American research culture that fused physics, oceanography, and mathematics into a single instrument of discovery. In the years that followed, captured German naval engineers often collaborated with their former enemies under peaceful research programs. Some were invited to American universities and research vessels. There, they saw firsthand the instruments that had undone them: precision echo sounders, temperature depth profilers, and arrays that turned sound into image. Many were astonished not just by the sophistication of the tools, but by the openness of post-war American science, the willingness to share, to publish, to teach. From the ashes of wartime secrecy arose new scientific partnerships. American and European oceanographers began compiling global sound velocity profiles, using the same data once gathered to track U-boats. The results would soon revolutionize navigation, communication, and exploration. By the mid-1950s, the technology had moved beyond warfare entirely. Commercial vessels now carried echo sounders as standard equipment. Survey ships used sonar to chart safe passages, pipelines, and undersea cables. Fishermen employed acoustic devices to locate schools of fish. Sound, once the hunter's tool, became humanity's link to the living world beneath the waves. And yet, its origin could never be separated from its shadow. Every ping, Every echo, every sonar trace carried the memory of the war that had forced humanity to listen. The haunting rhythm that once meant death to a U-boat crew now guided scientific discovery and maritime safety. German scientists who visited Woods Hole and Scripps in the post-war decades spoke often of that irony. In interviews, they described their awe at the American mastery of environmental knowledge, a kind of victory achieved not through superior weapons, but through superior understanding. "You did not conquer us with bombs," one engineer remarked. "You conquered the sea." That sentiment captured something larger than national defeat. It was the realization that science, when pushed to its limits by necessity, can outlive the very wars that create it. From the sonar ping that sank a U-boat to the acoustic wave that revealed the mid-Atlantic ridge, the continuum was unbroken. Sound, the simplest of natural forces, had carried humanity from destruction to discovery, from silence to knowledge. The battle for the Atlantic was long over, but the war's greatest secret victory was this. In learning to map the ocean, humanity had finally begun to understand its own planet. And deep below, where light cannot reach, the echoes still travel, silent witnesses, to the moment when war forced mankind to listen to the earth itself. Tendentur Thidru, story of how America used sound to map the ocean, is not simply a tale of wartime ingenuity. It is a story about perception, about how a nation faced with an unseen enemy in an unseen world chose to understand rather than merely react. In a war defined by steel and fire, victory beneath the waves came not from power, but from insight. The Germans built stronger hulls, quieter engines, more precise torpedoes, but the Americans built an idea that knowledge of nature could defeat even the most advanced machine. When those first sonar pings echoed through the Atlantic, they announced more than just a tactical triumph. They signaled the birth of a new human faculty, the ability to hear the shape of the world. For the first time in history, mankind had created an instrument that revealed the invisible. It is easy to forget how revolutionary that was. Until then, the ocean had been a mythic void, a place where men vanished. But after the war, through the technology born in desperation, the ocean became a landscape of measurable reality. A map drawn not in ink or light, but in sound. German engineers would later admit that what stunned them most was not America's industrial power, but its willingness to unite art, science, and warfare, to blend the imagination of a poet with the logic of a physicist. The result was something far greater than a weapon. It was a new way of seeing. From that discovery grew everything from Cold War submarine detection to modern oceanography, seismic imaging, and even our understanding of climate. The same echoes that once hunted submarines now study melting ice and migrating whales. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of all, that humanity's darkest conflicts can sometimes yield its deepest insight. The sea, once a symbol of mystery and death, became the first frontier of a listening planet. And every time a sonar wave ripples through the deep, tracing mountains that no light can touch, it carries with it the same silent question that began in war and ended in wonder.